I think we'll just go ahead and get started. This is the Doctors and Researchers panel, and how this panel works is I'm going to do a brief introduction of our panelists, and there will be a 3-minute timer. I'm going to ask them questions and keep them to 3 minutes so that you can take away as much information as possible. Some of our speakers have already spoken today. Some have not. Some are speaking tomorrow. So you can have something to look forward to tomorrow if you want to learn a little bit more about our speakers. So let's begin. The Doctors and Researchers panelists is going to go over some of the new medical cutting-edge interventions and treatments. So we'll be going over that today. Our panelists are Dr. Philip DeMeo. He's an internationally recognized autism physician as well as a father to a child with autism. He's the director of Whole Health and Wellness Centers located in Cleveland and Columbus, Ohio, and focuses his diagnosis and treatment for individuals on the spectrum. Dr. DeMeo is also the Chief Medical Officer for USAAA. So, and Dr. DeMeo, if you'll raise your hand, he's down there on the end. Sitting next to Dr. DeMeo is Dr. William Shaw. He is a researcher of the biomedical basis of autism and is board certified in the fields of clinical chemistry and toxicology. He's the founder of Great Plains Laboratory and is a big sponsor here at this conference, and we thank him for that. It allows us to provide scholarships. He's also the author of Biological Treatments for Autism and PDD, originally published in 1998. That was the very first book I ever bought. And Autism Beyond the Basics, published in 2009. He is also the stepfather of a child with autism and has helped thousands of patients and medical practitioners to successfully improve the lives of people with autism. So, Dr. Shaw. Next, we have Dr. Valerie Hu. She's a professor of biochemistry and molecular medicine at George Washington University and the mother of a son on the spectrum. Her research focus is developing biomarker-based diagnosis and personalized treatments for individuals on the autism spectrum. She's also the sole editor and one of the chapter authors for a recently released book entitled Frontiers of Autism Research, New Horizons for Diagnosis and Treatment. Next we have Dr. Michael Usler. He's the medical director of the Nuclear Medicine Department at St. John's Health Center in Santa Monica, California, assistant clinical professor of molecular and medical pharmacology at UCLA, and medical director of DrSpecScan.com. He is nationally recognized for his expertise of brain imaging and disorders such as autism spectrum disorders, and serves on our advisory board. So thank you, Dr. Usler, for being here. Next, we have Dr. Theodore Henderson. Dr. Henderson is a psychiatrist with a unique approach to treating those on the spectrum from a brain-based biological perspective and recognizes the limitations of the categorical philosophy of the DSM system. He co-wrote a chapter in the book, A Parent's and Teacher's Handbook on Identifying and Preventing Child Abuse in 1998, and participates in psychopharmacology, oh my goodness, web forums, the Society of Nuclear Medicine Brain Imaging Council, and is a guest editor for Journals of Psychiatry. Please welcome Dr. Henderson. Next we have Dr. Martha Herbert. She is a Harvard professor on the cutting edge of autism research. She is the director of Transcend, which stands for, it's this Transcend Research Program, Treatment, Research, and Neuroscience Evaluation of Neurodevelopmental Disorders. Dr. Herbert earned her medical degree at Columbia University, and her main research interests are in addressing autism as a dynamic encephalopathy, that means brain inflammation. And she has written the book, The Autism Revolution, Whole Body Strategies for Making Life All It Can Be. Next, we have Dr. Stoller. Dr. Stoller is a physician with expertise in functional medicine with 2 decades of experience focusing on brain-injured children and adults. He has published numerous articles on using hyperbaric oxygen to treat brain injuries and pioneered the use of hyperbaric oxygen for treating fetal alcohol syndrome and is president of the International Hyperbaric Medical Association. So please welcome our panel. And I'm going to start with questions. Martha, shall I hit you first? Martha, why don't you tell us a little bit about what's going on at Transcend and how it translates into the health of individuals on the spectrum?
So I started a multidisciplinary brain research program because I felt that there was a lot more going on in the brain and than most brain research was talking about. And it isn't just the brain, it's the whole body. And I had written a paper 9 years ago called "Is Autism a Brain Disorder or a Disorder That Affects the Brain?" Of course, I think it's the latter. And ever since then, I've been trying to work on what that means. I think there's a gigantic revolution going on in brain science that hasn't hit really the awareness of many of the people in brain research, which has to do with the whole, not just the neuronal part of the brain, but the whole brain as an organ of the body, where there are glial cells which outnumber neurons 4 to 1 to 10 to 1, which do the housekeeping of the brain. And since this audience is primarily women, I'll just tell you a funny story, which is that for many years, glial cells were just thought to be the glue, the background, the housemaids of the brain, and they were spoken of in the female gender. But now that we know that they perform sensory processing and all kinds of modulation of brain signaling, they've become male. Just there's a great 20-page feminist history of science paper I'm happy to share with anybody. So, but I really think that the reason that biomedical and multi-complex treatments for autism work is that you're helping the glial cells take out their trash, and because basically the glial cells get really messed up. They get clogged up with trash. As Mickey Ashner, a neurotoxicologist, said to me once, they can sequester trash up to a point, and then they can't take it anymore. They stop supporting the neurons. They stop giving the neurons glutathione. They stop doing a bunch of things. The fluid systems in the brain get backed up, and you can't function very well. And this is not unique to autism. But it comes out as autism, and that's a very interesting question why it does. And I have a chapter in Valerie's book talking about how the metabolic and the brain signaling interface with each other. It's amazing how little that's really looked at in a systematic way. So I have a bunch of busy bees analyzing data that I've collected over the last 5 years on how the brain is the way the different parts of the brain that you can image, not only how big it is, not only the signaling, but we are now doing glutathione spectroscopy, although I don't have a lot of data on that, mitochondrial spectroscopy, and we have a pile of data on babies starting from prenatal to birth, and then 8 visits from 2 weeks to 3 months, tracking how autism emerges in the earliest part of life, in the brain, in the oxidative stress, in the inflammation system. This was a very difficult study to conduct. But our first passes through the data were significant. And it really helps if you have the right hypothesis. My hypothesis is that regression comes from a progressive breakdown of the physiological integrity of the brain through a combination of maybe genetic weak spots and a lot of insults. And so I think that it's really important to look at this because it gives a scientific basis for why these treatments, which wouldn't make sense to a lot of neuron-based brain scientists, could actually work, and we really need support and understanding for what these approaches are about, and they apply not only in autism, but in many other conditions, like I said, brain trauma, Alzheimer's, mood disorders, and many other things. So that's what we're doing.
Thanks, Martha. I'm going to go to Dr. Who now, Valerie.
I totally agree. Okay, totally agree with Dr. Herbert. in that we consider as a working hypothesis that autism is more of a systems disorder with strong neurological manifestations. And this has allowed us to look outside of the brain to get some clues, too, about what might be dysfunctional in an individual with autism. And I know when we first started this work about almost 10 years ago, looking at cells that were derived from blood cells, blood lymphocytes, people thought I was crazy, and some of them still do. But nevertheless, what our studies revealed was that even though you're studying cells from peripheral tissue, such as blood, there are many molecular signatures there that applied to the brain. And then when we followed up by doing some actual studies on postmortem brain tissues, we saw some of the same dysfunction occurring in the brain. And so that helped us to kind of link some of the molecular aspects of autism from the blood to the brain. And that has practical importance in the sense that it's really, really difficult, I think, as all of you know, to get postmortem brain tissues from anybody. And obviously, you can't get brain tissues from living individuals either. And also, for the purpose of developing diagnostic biomarkers, you have to look at peripheral tissues. You cannot, have a child come in and say, can I have a piece of your brain tissue so I can see whether or not you've got autism? So there's many practical reasons for looking outside of the brain for signatures, molecular signatures that help you understand more of the biology of autism, as well as being useful for diagnostics.
Thanks. Dr. Shah, we've been talking about autism in terms of, it's got markers. It's biomedical. What have you seen in testing in terms of common outcomes or levels that you're seeing in the laboratory?
Yeah, I think we've identified probably about 200 different markers that are more frequent or more common in autism, and adjusting down the things that are high and adjusting up the things that are low have all been successful in those 200. But the one factor I'm convinced is that the main factor is the acetaminophen, and really all we need to do is to get one geographic area, one state, one country to ban it, and then show a pronounced decrease in the rate of autism. That's all that's needed to, in my mind, to stop the whole thing. To bring it won't stop all autism, but it should bring autism back to the levels of the 1970s. If we can completely eliminate acetaminophen use by pregnant women and eliminate acetaminophen use by young children, just that change should dramatically reduce the rate of autism. The reason it's so important is that the acetaminophen metabolite is present in much higher concentrations than all the other toxic chemical metabolites combined. Drugs are given at roughly 1,000 times greater concentration than our exposure to various toxic chemicals. And so when we're giving it deliberately, we're producing a toxic environment at huge doses. And the acetaminophen metabolite is toxic to virtually every protein that has been studied. Its activity is impaired by the major acetaminophen metabolite. So just that change, and really, I mean, my ultimate goal is to bring autism back to the rates it was in the 1970s by putting the word out. And I mean, what we need eventually is a simple warning letter on bottles of acetaminophen that says avoid this use for young children and pregnant women, as there have been some associations with autism. I think by putting that warning label on, that would be enough that most people would not use it anymore for pregnant women or children.
Before you pass,
and of course, just one other comment. The most common name you'll see on the TV set is Tylenol. Probably 90% of the market is in the form of Tylenol. That's the brand name.
And in Europe, it's like paracetamol.
Paracetamol in the much of the rest of the world. So countries that have very low acetaminophen use have very low autism rates. Countries that have high acetaminophen use have high autism rates, but also high rates of attention deficit and very high rates of asthma. So these three disorders, the AAA disorders, are all associated with increased acetaminophen use.
I just wanted to mention one other exposure. Boys get circumcised and they get 6 doses of Tylenol within the first day. That's just something to consider.
Yeah. Hearing Dr. Shah's presentation this afternoon or this morning really piqued my interest in it. I'm going to look more into it, into the pathways and so forth, and the genes that may be affected. But I wanted to ask also...
Pull up your mic just a little bit.
I also wanted to ask a follow-up question, and you may have mentioned it, but I forgot. Did you say that there were also animal studies where mice or rats or whatever were exposed to Tylenol and then monitored for their behaviors? Did you say that? I don't remember.
I was talking about exposure to the casomorphin, which is the opiate peptide derived from milk. But there have been plenty of animal studies that indicate a whole variety of toxic effects on animals exposed to acetaminophen, but not, and including exposure of cultured neurons to levels of acetaminophen metabolite that are common in everyday use, and it caused a profound toxicity to the cell cultures of neurons. So all the research data is very compelling. There's probably, I think there was around 6,000 articles I found in PubMed dealing with acetaminophen toxicity, and so I feel that it is that the number of papers recently has reached a point where I think it, at the minimum, it requires a warning. I would prefer there to be a ban, but I don't know if that's practical. But I think a warning would be adequate to eliminate the majority of usage by the people who are vulnerable.
Thank you. I'm going to throw a question to Dr. Stoller and Dr. DeMio. Since we're talking about acetaminophen, I'm wondering how you handle that in your practice, and if there are other medications or items that you would recommend parents avoid with their children. Dr. DeMio, do you want to start that?
Well, there are a lot of instances where Tylenol brand or the acetaminophen would be appealing to a doctor. It doesn't make you bleed up front. I mean, it does down the road. But if you're having surgery, and Dr. Herbert mentioned the circumcision for the boys, where you don't want somebody to bleed, Motrin, aspirin, Advil, Aleve, all the other over-the-counters will make a person get thinner blood. So we instead use Celebrex sometimes, but Celebrex, which you can dose for children, we actually have a protocol that we developed, and very few doctors out there use Celebrex for children. There's more of it. It has lactose in it, one of those sugars I talked about, and a lot of kids are lactose intolerant. Whenever there's lactose in a drug, and you see it in the ingredients of the filler, there's always some casein, and then Dr. Shah talked about the casein issues today. So many of the kids may not be able to use that, or they can only use it for a brief period of time. You can have compounding pharmacies make some of the opiates ahead of time, whether it's something like Dilaudid or something of that nature ahead of time, which has no acetaminophen, no Motrin, and they can make it without casein and without any of that. There are instances where the child either has had acetaminophen or, and let me just say the worst form of that, potentially without any considerations, is the rectal form, because the kid's often vomiting. They have fewer calories. You need calories to make glutathione. Glutathione protects you against the acetaminophen issues that Dr. Shah is talking about. And so the bottom line is, if we have to give acetaminophen, we get it compounded and we give lots of glutathione with it. So those are some of the options.
Dr. Stoller, did you have anything to add?
The only thing I would add is what acetaminophen does is cause the glutathione levels to crash. So you cannot really take enough glutathione. And I often recommend, especially in the early stages of biomedical intervention, is to be taking as much as 2,000 milligrams a day of glutathione. And my favorite form of glutathione for practical pedestrian reasons is the S-acetyl L-glutathione, which can pass through the stomach without breaking down, and it doesn't have a funky flavor, and it can be mixed with things without having that weird sulfury flavor that liposomal glutathione has. That's my personal preference, but that's what I'd add to this conversation.
Thanks. Dr. Soler, I wanted to go ahead and ask you another question. I know that you are a functional medicine doctor. Can you explain some of the differences in the approach of functional medicine than what others may be used to in terms of pursuing treatment for their kids? How would that look different?
So I'm the only pediatrician, or former pediatrician really, at the Amen clinics. And so I'm practicing functional or integrative medicine. And in a nutshell, that really boils down to is we look for the underlying cause of the problem, and we don't stop until we find it, and we treat the underlying cause if we can identify it. And it usually can be identified. It doesn't mean we have, always stellar success, but that's what we try to do. And so there's no painting over rust or Band-Aids. I mean, you may need a Band-Aid, and I'm not saying you shouldn't have a Band-Aid, but we better find out what caused the laceration in the first place. And that's what we go for, and we don't stop, and we don't give up. A lot of doctors will say, this is out of my bailiwick, or whatever, see somebody else. You rarely hear that from a functional or integrative medicine doctor.
Thanks. Dr. Henderson, I know that while your profession is psychiatry, I'm just wondering, I know you have a different approach. Could you share some of how your approach differs from what would be considered a traditional approach?
Well, psychiatry is based on the DSM system. Now we have DSM-5, which, by the way, makes the name of this organization non-existent. I have no love for the DSM-5, and neither does Tom Insel, who's the head of the National Institute of Mental Health. He, in fact, said, if you want funding from NIMH, do not present a study that's based on DSM-5 criteria. If you need to present biomarkers, neuroimaging, something other than DSM-5 criteria. And what does that mean for me is that DSM-5 is the Bible of psychiatry. It's where they say, okay, they look up and they check off this list like a Chinese menu of symptoms that somebody has to say, oh, you have ADHD, inattentive type, or whatever. But the reality is that if you look at the behavioral phenotypes, there's this tremendous overlap between ADHD, generalized anxiety disorder, mania, oppositional defiant disorder, and other. We won't go into that. So these diagnoses that the DSM is based on, they put you into this little box. Oh, you have oppositional defiant disorder. Therefore, we throw these medicines into that box. And that's supposed to treat ODD. But the problem is what is ODD? What is oppositional defiant disorder? Well, you're oppositional and you're defiant. Why? Is it genetic? Is it neurobiological? Are you having partial complex seizures? Do you have cadmium toxicity? Just to name a few. And what does it mean prognostically? And what's the medication for oppositional defiant disorder? Well, it depends on what's really going on in the brain. So my approach is I look at what's going on in the brain. I'll ask adults and kids questions about what do things do to your brain. And so, in other words, what does caffeine do to you? Well, it makes me tired. Well, that's different from what a lot of people say, which is, well, it kind of picks me up in the morning. It's a very important neurobiological clue. And so starting to understand how the brain works, and this is where brain scans come in. brain scans, particularly in complicated cases, are essential. And I think Dr. Usler can speak more eloquently to that than I. And once you've started to figure out what's the mechanism within the brain, then you're targeting it with treatments for that mechanism. So someone comes in saying, I'm depressed, but what's going on in their brain is not typical major depression, then an SSRI probably is not going to help them.
Segue. Oh, can you hear me? So I wanted to hand that over to Dr. Usler to find out a little bit more about SPECT imaging and its role in terms of what does it tell us about kids on the spectrum? What do you see?
Well, as has been mentioned over here, we can't do whether it's postmortem or premortem biopsies. So one of the things that SPECT imaging does, so this is a way of using some tracer substances that go to the brain, that's a functioning brain, and by using SPECT technology, which is just an imaging technology, we can actually make a map of the functional pattern throughout all regions of the brain and can ask ourselves questions that say, what does that pattern tell us, the functional pattern in the brain, and what do we learn from that independent of whatever is the clinical presentation of the person? Now, observing the behavior of individuals is important. Autism as itself is a clinical diagnosis. It's not a scan diagnosis. So we're not using functional imaging to make a diagnosis. We're using it, as Dr. Henderson indicated over here, to say, look at the function patterns. What does that tell us as to how this brain is working versus how that person's brain is working? And how is that maybe related or not related to the clinical behavior? How does that enable us to have targeted therapy based upon the brain function that we see, whatever is the clinical diagnosis? So Dr. Henderson showed earlier today a presentation of 2 children that were on the autism spectrum. Their behavior patterns were relatively the same, and yet one of them had areas of the brain that are overactive, and the other one had areas of the brain that were underactive, and the therapeutic approach to those 2 situations is different. And we learned that from looking at functional information of the brain itself, and not just simply by looking at the behavior of individuals.
Thanks. You guys are doing great with time. Dr. Stoller, you're the president of the International Hyperbaric Medical Association. My own daughter has had the benefit of hyperbarics. I was hoping you could share with our audience the role of hyperbaric oxygen treatment. Are there things that are beneficial to do beforehand, before pursuing it? And you know, how should a parent go about receiving that information?
Well, I wrote a very nice introductory article for the TACA handbook on what parents should understand about using hyperbaric therapy in treating autism spectrum children. Essentially, it boils down to the mitochondria, the little organelles that take oxygen and sugar and convert that into ATP, the gasoline the cells run on. Under pressure, oxygen will rehabilitate those mitochondria by doing some DNA signaling, and that signaling takes place through a very subtle form of oxidative stress. So not all oxidative stress is a bad thing. That's how the hyperbaric oxygen signals the DNA in the mitochondria. And those mitochondria, whether they've been poisoned or injured or however they've been knocked offline, lack of oxygen, because they work under very low oxygen tensions. The body doesn't really have a good way of turning them back on. So under pressure, oxygen does just that, and it's not rocket science. It's that simple. And when the mitochondria come back online, now the neurons or whatever cells they happen to find themselves in have the energy to do their job. So you don't, of course, want to wake up neurons that are still swimming in whatever horrible toxic soup knocked them out in the first place. So if there's an infection that needs to be treated, if there's heavy metal issues, those need to be treated. And so I normally save hyperbaric therapy as the icing on the cake. Now, there's no time where it's not going to be a benefit, but for most people, since it's not free. You just can't get hyperbaric oxygen therapy because you want it. You want to use it at the most auspicious time, and that's when you're already well underway in a biomedical program where your diet's been straightened out, you've eliminated things that will inflame the immune system, detoxification is underway, the appropriate supplements like glutathione have been started, and then you add in the hyperbaric oxygen after all those ducks are lined up. So when I had my hyperbaric oxygen clinic in Santa Fe, New Mexico, many of the children with autism, quote unquote, because I don't even like using that word because it doesn't, autism is a behavioral DSM diagnosis, and this is a medical problem. So we're really, for the vast majority of children, dealing with an encephalitis. Not everyone has that encephalitis for the same reason, but it's an encephalitis just the same. And most of the affected kids, well, they couldn't afford hyperbaric oxygen therapy. So I had a portable chamber, which goes to 1.3 atmospheres, and compressed room air. And I didn't even add any oxygen into the portable chamber. I says, I'll treat you guys for free. Got a portable chamber here. Doesn't cost me anything extra to use that. And I purposely didn't put any extra oxygen in it because it's not the absolute amount of oxygen. It's the pressure with whatever oxygen is there that is the therapeutic key for this. So many of them got better. The parents found ways of raising the money to use 100% oxygen. And, of course, that's how I paid the rent, so I wasn't going to discourage them from doing that. But the point was they got better on compressed room air, 1.3 atmospheres. So it doesn't take much to start the DNA signaling process to get those mitochondria to come back online. And that is where this piece, this particular therapy comes in for treating kids on the spectrum.
Sorry about that. I shut my mic off. All right. I want to just kind of throw a generalized question that all of you will have an opportunity to answer. What do you feel the key components are of, if you had 3 items, parents' time, it's really precious. What are the 3 things that parents should be looking at as they pull together a treatment plan? How should they approach it? What are the 3 top ones that you give parents as an approach? Dr. DeMille, we'll start with you.
Yeah, well, the quick answer would be diets, probiotics, and zinc, which are important. But I would also clean up the home in my talk, and Dr. Stoller's done a lot of work on this. I think everybody up here has talked about these things. If there's toxins going in, you want to eliminate those. So, painting the house and new carpets and things, you have to air that out and do those things in the summer and steam the carpets. But if there's mold in the home, and if the diet has a lot of toxicity, if the child is willing, or the adult person or yourself, those need to be as clean as possible, because the people that we're talking about are very sensitive to the amounts of toxins that are eventually, I'm not trying to sound harsh, going to give us all cancer and heart attacks and all that later. It's tragic when they get hit when they're 18 months old, or in the uterus, or by the time they're 7 or 10 or something like that, or a young adult couple, one of whom has fibromyalgia. Those are examples of somebody who got hit and got aged too early. So those are the issues there, and I think that that's just a start. So if you wanted to do something that's doable, even though diets are hard, those are the types of things, and we've talked about several of them. My wife's going to talk about that on Sunday morning. Julie Matthews is here. Other people have talked about this issue. Also, I'd mentioned that Dr. Henderson also said regarding the pain thing we talked about with Tylenol, gabapentin and finding out where the pain is, those are also ways to avoid acetaminophen.
So we go in sequence, okay? So the 3 things: eliminate the severe allergic foods, normalize the intestinal flora, which are the yeast, the candida, the toxic bacteria in the intestinal tract, and remove any of the toxic chemicals to which the child has been exposed. So those are the three most common things, and virtually all of them are beneficial. So it's it sounds easy, but it takes quite a lot of time and energy to actually do these things. But everyone can do them. There's no reason why every child can't have this kind of treatment and be a success.
I guess the only things I would add to what has been said already are, and this is really more from it's a more common sense type of thing than from my research, would be to reduce stress by any means you can, including yoga, meditation, anything. You know, I think stress, regardless of where it comes from, has a common pathway. And by trying to reduce, stress from the environment through better diets, etc., that's going to help. The second thing that I could think of is to encourage sensory stimulation, sensory and mental stimulation, because studies do show that promotes neurogenesis, proper connections of the neurons, etc. So I think these two things can only help anybody, regardless of whether or not they have autism, and certainly will not hurt. Now, as for the third one, I can't think of anything right now, so I'm going to pass it on. Okay.
Well, I'm not directly involved in the primary care of the autism spectrum individuals, so I don't have standard three things that I would utilize. And I'll pass the baton shortly to my colleague, Dr. Henderson, who's really the clinical expert in our organization. One thing that I would say, though, is that because I'm involved with functional brain imaging, there's still people out there, I'm told, it surprises me, who don't know that this is a medical condition and who don't really get a sense that there's some brain function or dysfunction involved in this. So for anybody, if you hear that they still think this is just some sort of a mental illness or a psychiatric diagnosis or what have you, there's real brain dysfunction, and we have some tools to deal with that after you start out with some of the basic clinical steps.
Thanks. Oh, okay. All right. It's hard when you're later down the line. So what I'd like to do is actually talk to you about the concept. And the concept is, what is autism? I think it's already been said, autism is not a thing. And I think I said this last year. Autism is a spectrum of, and I'm not talking spectrum of conditions, but it's a whole bunch of different things that affect the brain, that injure the brain, that lead to a final behavioral outcome. And so when you look at that, if we stand back etiologically for a moment and say, what's causing that? I'm going to express a theory. It's not a new theory. It's not my theory. It's a theory that this is really about at least a three-hit model. So there's a genetic vulnerability. And Dr. Hu is exploring that. And, some of the stuff I heard today just really excited me because it fits with some of the things that I see are actually reparative. So, the idea of actual brain repair jumps to mind for me. So we got a genetic vulnerability. Then there's a second hit. And that second hit can be acetaminophen. It can be a virus. It can be a variety of things that we don't quite know yet, okay, early on. And then there's a third hit, which is often an environmental factor. And this is where the vaccine story comes in. Highly controversial, I know, but I've got plenty of videotape of kids before and after. And that's the only thing that makes the vaccine story make sense. The only thing that makes it make sense is a vulnerability, a first hit that sets them up. They have an impaired immune system, and then something happens, whether it's a vaccine or a toxin or new carpet or whatever. Okay? So recently there was a publication, SSRIs during pregnancy are responsible for the increase in autism. This is a correlational study. Now, if you look at the time frame of the study, something else is also correlated with that. Texting on cell phones. So texting on cell phones by mothers during pregnancy cause autism. You can make exactly the same correlational argument with exactly the same logic and probably better statistics. I haven't tested that. So the theory I want you to be thinking about is that there are multiple hits. There's not one thing. We're not going to find one thing. We're not going to find one gene. So if we keep opening our minds to the possibilities. So treatment-wise, let's take the example of someone who's one of my patients we've sent the labs to Dr. Shah's lab, and they've come back, everything's normal. They're not allergic to anything. How often does that happen? The urine oxalic acids are normal. The gut flora is normal. Absolutely everything is in the normal range. And yet they're still autistic. So then you have to say, work with the parents. Okay, what are the behaviors that are creating problems? In other words, what are the comorbidities? You have to identify what that is. If it's anxiety, then treat anxiety. Antipsychotics are not a treatment for anxiety. But I've heard at least 2 moms today tell me the story of the progressive increase in atypical antipsychotics in their child for the treatment of anxiety. And they're antipsychotics. Although Seroquel is FDA approved in adults for generalized anxiety disorder, but when you look at its effect size, it's not very good. So the take-home message is, what's the symptom you're trying to treat, and target that treatment.
I want to take off from one thing you said there. It's again, a lot of the great stuff has already been said here. I don't think autism is a thing either, but I think it's a process. And it's a process of the brain doing the best it can when it has a lot of junk in it doesn't need, and it's missing a lot of supports. And that situation arises from what I would call, and Patty Lemur, I recommend her new book, Understanding Autism, because it actually has a lot of good brain stuff in it. But the total load, which is this whole pileup, this cascade, this tsunami of garbage that comes from living in an economic system that is dependent on selling you a lot of junk in order to keep keep us from having another depression. But the price we pay for that is we're all getting sick and the planet's falling apart. And one of the ways that's manifesting itself is our kids. And the other part in the human population is the chronic illness epidemic. One of the things what was not mentioned that I want to mention, there's actually a thing, is healthy fats. Your brain is made up of lipid membranes, among other things. They have to be healthy. They get damaged. You need healthy essential fatty acids. You need a lot more fat in the diet than what people have been telling you, but not the garbage trans fats. You need real good fats. And if you buy coconut oil, don't buy the refined kind because all of the good stuff has been taken out. Another thing in the common sense department, I have a long paper that's on my website, Autism and EMF, which is electromagnetic fields, ? Plausibility of a pathophysiological link. And everything that we know about the physiology of autism, you also can see that as being caused or aggravated by EMF. So things you can do for your kid that are really common sense are unplug all the gizmos in the bedroom when your kid is sleeping, in your bedroom too. Don't, watch out for when you're pregnant, don't plug in your computer and put it on your lap because it has a lot more EMF that gets close to the fetus. Men should not carry their cell phones near their testes. It's well established that cell phone exposure can cause sperm damage. This is an emerging area of concern. I think it's a real issue, and in a precautionary way, these are things that you can do. As a process, autism, it's not just that it's caused and then you have it as if it were stamped in the brain. It's generated on a moment-to-moment basis. And so I would say every choice should be a healthy choice, because every bit of support you give and every bit of exposure you remove will give the brain more space and the whole body to function better and let these cells, like what Ken Stoller was saying before, start to reset themselves in a healthier way, to take out the trash, to start functioning again when they're offline. So every choice should be a healthy choice.
Well, my 3 things have already been mentioned, but I think I even said them before the question was asked. I'll just use this opportunity to talk about one of my New Mexico patients who's in his early 20s now. It took 10 years to convince that mom to go on a gluten-free diet, not for herself, but for her son. Because, you know, the kid he ate what he wanted to eat, he knew what he wanted to eat, and he didn't want to be eating gluten-free. But his seizure disorder kept getting worse and worse. And finally, after practically a decade, it seemed, plus or minus, she put him on a gluten-free diet, and there was a dramatic decrease in the seizures. So diet is probably the most important thing. Diet and supplements and nutraceuticals are probably the most important thing one can be doing for an intervention. Now, he still has some seizures, so I have him on CBDs, the cannabidiols, which definitely affect the way information and electrical activity is taking place in the brain. Very healing substance. They're completely legal, even though, I mean, if you get 100% CBDs and there's no THC in them, they can be sold across state lines, doesn't require a prescription. Some might argue that the CBDs from the high strain marijuanas are more potent than the CBDs from hemp, and they probably are. But we put him on that, and that was very therapeutic for him. But then she said the prodrome before his seizures was he would get a lot of gas. There would be a lot of gas taking place. And although the CBDs would put things off to delay the inevitable, he'd still end up having a seizure. Well, I says, well, what does that show? There's some kind of dysbiosis going on. This kid has an intestinal imbalance in his flora that hasn't been corrected yet. So that's what we had to attack next. So it's just one example of how convoluted and complicated some of these cases can be, because one child, you put him on a gluten-free diet, it takes care of everything. Game's over. That's it. That was it. And at the other extreme, you can do absolutely everything perfectly, and the child does not improve. I've seen it both ways. And it's incredibly frustrating, obviously, in the latter example. But, you know, you do what you can do. So we know it works on most of the kids most of the time. We have a good handle on a lot of different biomarkers that can guide us and give us clues about what's happening. And, you know, thank goodness for, you know, Great Plains Lab, which is, you know, probably one of the more stellar labs in flushing out issues, metabolic issues, and being able to identify them. So we have some clue as to what direction, what tree to bark up. But it's a process, and it can be a very expensive process, and it's maddening and it's frustrating, and we're 10 years past when this should have been put to bed. With the vaccine issue, I mean, it's just the corruption, the incredible bureaucratic corruption and greed that has bled out the agencies in our government to do the bidding of those with the money, with the gold. Those with the gold make the rules, and they write the history, and they dictate what medicine is. And so this epidemic of neurodevelopmental problems has gone on at least 10 years longer than it has needed to. But hopefully things are about to change.
Thanks. I just want to poll our audience really quickly before we move on. I'm just wondering, how many here, is this your first conference? Wow, thank you for being here. Let me see a show of hands on parents or grandparents, you know, family, teachers, other professionals. Good mix. Thank you all for being here. So for how many of you is this new information in terms of, did you think autism was a mental issue, or did you know it had medical features? It was a biomedical condition. Is that new news? Let me see a show of hands on, is that new? Only a couple. Okay, that's a little surprising. Well, I'm really glad you're here. I want to move into, I want to encourage you, if you have questions that I'm not asking or you want to get me to ask one, quietly put something right here on the stage and I'll come down and get it. Dr. Usler, this question's for you. In your practice in doing SPECT scans, could you give us an idea of why you think there's a high prevalence of cerebral hyperfusion in our children?
Why do you think
That was something I had here.
I heard you say hyperperfusion. Hypoperfusion. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So first of all, is that just for how many of you actually know what a SPECT scan is? Okay.
Well, let's start there.
Okay. So the bottom line is this: is that in order to know how any body system works, in particular in the field of nuclear medicine, which is what I primarily represent, is that in order to do a function study, we inject the person with a trace quantity of substance that goes to an organ system, and because there's a trace quantity that's given, it doesn't disturb the function of the organ system that we're measuring, because that would obviously defeat the purpose of the test. So what the SPECT imaging has done is the person gets a very small trace quantity of an isotope substance that goes to the brain in relation to how all the regions of the brain are working at the time the person is injected. And that's an important distinction, that this is not what's happening in the SPECT scan machine, it's what happens when the person is injected. This brings about the ability to look at a person's brain function in a variety of different conditions, whether the person is at rest or whether they're performing a cognitive challenge. So we can make some distinctions about how the brain responds to certain circumstances. But given that the person has gotten the injection, the isotope is in the brain within 2 minutes, and the person is then subsequently placed in the scan machine. Now, many of the children in the autism spectrum can't really cooperate, so we do have to give them some sedative, but it's only while they're in the scanner, not at any time before or after that. So what happens is we get the information from the scan, and it doesn't come out in terms of a diagnosis. It comes out in terms of this area of the brain seems to be working at a level below what we expect. We have some normative data base for a reference purpose. Some areas of the brain are overactive. Because the tracer flow is fundamentally associated with regional brain cell function, which is closely related to the way blood flow is in the brain at the time that it's operating. Because remember, the brain doesn't store any nutrients, so it needs ongoing oxygen and blood supply and glucose to keep working. So the metabolism pattern that we see represents regional brain function, and as you indicated, the question becomes then in terms of blood flow. The speaking of this is hypoperfusion, meaning there's a lower level of brain perfusion, which means that's related to a lower level of brain function. And so the question, and for many years, the thought was that if anything was going wrong in the brain, it must be because the brain function in a particular region is below the expected amount. And so many of the articles, and I'll present this in a little bit tomorrow in my presentation, is the initial work in publications where there's all this hypoperfusion in the brain, areas of underfunctioning. As we learned so there can be a variety of causes of that. The SPECT scan itself isn't a direct causative agent. In other words, it's simply, we're looking at the metabolism, we're looking at brain function. We still need a lot of clinical information to find out why it could be that areas of the brain are underactive or underfunctioning. One of the, and I know we'll complete on this shortly, but I wanted to point out, not only did the conversation and the question start out as hypoperfusion, but one of the observations we made over the last 10 years was that there are also many regions in the brain that are overactive. So there's hyperperfusion as well as hypoperfusion. And in fact, is my observation of scanning more than 1,000 children on the autism spectrum is most children have a combination of things. areas of underactivity and areas of overactivity. And it becomes a matter of then of, again, not looking at a clinical diagnosis, but saying, what could we do, understanding that this person, whatever their clinical presentation is primarily overactive, or this area of the brain is underactive, hypoperfuse, that's another way of saying it. How does the way that the brain is telling us that it's functioning help us to know what's the next best thing to help this individual at this time?
Is it on? Great. Dr. Henderson, I was hoping that maybe you could discuss a little bit the aggression in your practice, how you help parents and people on the spectrum handle aggressive tendencies.
Are we talking about my aggression or?
Well, we might be talking about mine. I don't know, but help us out.
All right. So aggression and autism. I mean, it's a very easy answer. Risperdal, right? That's the medication for aggression. I'm sorry. I'm kidding. The FDA-approved treatments for aggression and autism are Risperdal and Abilify. Okay? But it's essentially chemical restraint in many cases. Now, I'm not saying don't ever do it. Sometimes it's very useful on a short-term basis. But when you look at aggression and autism, and essentially aggression in anybody, you need to ask why. You know, when does it occur? What's the situations in which it occurs? Is it 4 o'clock every day? Because then that's when mom starts making dinner and stops paying attention, and therefore it's an attention-seeking strategy. Is it when they ride the bus home from the day treatment program and they don't like that bus driver, or some other passenger has hurt them and they're scared? Why are they aggressive? So you need to first ask the why question. And that's a really important place to start, is looking at the environmental pieces and it's not about refrigerator mom, it's about what's going on dynamically for that child. Because aggression is a form of expression, but it's not necessarily expression of anger. It's expression of fear, of frustration, etc. When you look at treating aggression, then I don't leap to Risperdal or Abilify. I start with things that work on the adrenaline system. So I'll often use alpha-1 blockers. Cardura, for example, works quite well. Or Tenex, which you're all familiar with, is an alpha-2. It sort of pushes the brakes on the adrenaline system, so it sort of lowers adrenaline. Dr. DeMio showed this great photo of a kid with autism, and his pupils were widely dilated, just adrenalized. And think about when you're in an adrenaline overdrive, and you're more impulsive, and you're more rash, and you're more aggressive. The other part of aggression is to think a little bit about what we're learning about the relationship between the immune system and the mind. So there's a recent study that showed that aggressive drivers, road rage drivers, had elevated levels of C-reactive protein. C-reactive protein it's a very rapid response piece of activation of the immune system, the bad pro-inflammatory aspects of the immune system. So we're starting to learn, and in fact, I'm working on maybe doing a study where we actually capture kids in rage, inject the isotope to do the scan, and pull blood at the same time to look at the cytokine profile. Can you imagine this study? And the beauty of a SPECT scan is you can capture a kid during a rage outburst. You can capture a kid during a seizure. You can capture someone jumping out of an airplane, if you like, whatever the situation. They don't have to be in the scanner because the isotope takes the picture. And the picture stays there for 2-3 hours. And then you can get them into the scanner, and the camera just develops the film. That's the beauty of SPECT scanning. You don't get that with PET scanning. You don't get that with fMRI. It's the beauty of what's considered by many an old and experimental and useless technology when we have fMRI and all tensor diffusion imaging and other types of things to do. But old is not bad. So
May I add a little something?
I was just going to say, if there are
Okay.
panelists that want to tag in on the aggression
As
thing, please do.
as a present spec scanner for a few decades and as a former flight surgeon, I'm really not about to be injecting anybody as they're jumping out of a perfectly good airplane. Okay.
Oh, Martha. Go ahead, Martha.
Okay. Yeah, what I wanted to say is that what I would love to do is to collaborate with you and study
Pull up your
gene
mic.
expression. I would love to collaborate with Dr. Henderson's and Usler and study what is going on biochemically, metabolically, in terms of the expression profiles of those individuals where you've essentially phenotyped them by these imaging. Because coupling that with taking a snapshot of what is going on inside their cells, their tissues, I think will be very powerful in helping to maybe not just suggest which medication that you know, which psychotropic or psychoactive medication might be useful for them, but also to identify perhaps certain metabolic pathways that were not known to be associated with that brain phenotype. I would love to do that. Yeah. Can someone help us get the money?
Brainstorming. There's a new study unfolding before your eyes. Dr.
Well,
Camillo, do you want to add to that?
Look how excited a bunch of nerdy scientists get when they hear about raging and these tragic crisis moments. I mean, that's really the dedication that I mean, it's just the mindset and everything, particularly with what Dr. Hu just said. As far as I go, if you'll hook me up to a brain scanner and go to all that trouble to get two of them together, I'll jump out of an airplane anytime you want me to. I was about to do that on the way here. I won't mention the airline, you know, so. But, you know, the flight attendant told me we're about to land, so make it quick. She didn't care what I did. She just wanted me to get back to the seat. I'll give you a three-part answer because the elegant people to my right gave more, you know, biologic and physiologic answers. Theanine, lithium, and inositol, and you can go to the New Beginnings little, you know, booth over there and look at those things. And the lithium is natural lithium. Don't let the stigma of the psychiatric dosing, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's totally different. I'm talking about lithium that's in celery and potatoes and peaches. All the potassium foods that are out there, for those of you who have heart problems and they tell you to eat these things, they also take up lithium if they're grown in the right soil and all this, which is more so in organic food. But the lithium that I'm talking about, only not because it's any better than the theanine and the inositol, but it's got that stigma. And you can't use it if the person has kidney problems, but on certain medications, most of our kids that doesn't apply to. Well, lithium is a natural substance that's calming. And so is potassium and magnesium. You can go look at the New Beginnings. I showed one of the moms that today. And those are often overlooked, not because these people don't know that, but those are simple things you can do. It pushes the envelope because we all use those things to be calm, you know, and so I stood up in the airplane and screamed and asked if anybody had any natural lithium derived from celery, and I didn't get an answer, so, you know. Yeah. Most people had their earplugs in and they were listening to something.
Dr.
I wanted to put in the plug for, so first of all, I would say that if any of you have ever had the suggestion that you need Risperdal for your child, I would think that perhaps 98% of the time it's due to Clostridia infections of the intestinal tract. And the reason it affects the brain is the Clostridia produces chemicals that inhibit the conversion of dopamine to norepinephrine, so the person is left with a marked excess of dopamine. And some individuals, the ratio can be up to 70 to 1, whereas the normal ratio is 1 to 1. And so I saw this in my own family. My stepdaughter, she was starting to hit herself, and for the first time we ever saw this behavior, she was pinching the other children in the daycare services where she goes in the daytime, and we tested it. So of course, since I run the laboratory, I said, well, do an organic acid. We found that she had the Clostridia difficile. and treated for that, and there's no more aggression. The same thing, a child of a pediatrician, the extreme abnormal behavior while taking her child for a medical appointment, he kicked out the windows in the back seat of the car. And again, it was the Clostridia problem. So if you hear the word Risperdal in your mind, you need to put equals Clostridia overgrowth of the GI tract. And if you, and in the majority of cases, that will resolve the problem. And then another very common problem is cholesterol deficiency. So cholesterol deficiency is associated with aggression in children with autism, but they also found in families where there were generation of killers, they found that the families had very low amounts of cholesterol. So low cholesterol causes aggression, and so it is one of the most common things. Look at your child's cholesterol value. If it's less than 160, it can be associated with aggression. The lower it is, the more aggressive typically the child becomes. And I've got to talk tomorrow, so I've just done a sneak preview for my talk tomorrow about the benefits of cholesterol. All of you have heard all the TV commercials about the bad effects of high cholesterol, but I'm going to now talk about the other end, the bad effects of low cholesterol.
Does anyone else want to tag in on the aggression, just observations you've had, thoughts, theories?
I'm just going to add one thing, one
you
short
have to
thing.
hold up
My
your
third
mic, though.
thing, huh?
Hold up your
Hold the
mic.
speaker.
Thank you.
Okay, third thing, because I could only think of two previously. Get a dog or a pet, because I think that can be very beneficial not only for your child but for yourself. Because about in 2002, 12 years ago, we got our first dog, pet, golden retriever, and I always called her, and now my second one, golden stress reliever. But there's a real advantage too, because science does show, I think you all know that about oxytocin, the social hormone, and how some people with autism are deficient in it, and in fact they're using it for clinical trials. But there are studies that show that petting a dog or an animal, a pet like a cat or a dog, really induces oxytocin in the petter. So that's a way of getting free oxytocin. I had my son enrolled in a oxytocin nasal trial at Mount Sinai about 2001, and it turned out at the end where I thought I was seeing effects that it was placebo. But so we took 6 train rides to Mount Sinai for nothing. But in any case, we could have just had him pet the dog, and get it free. But that. And not only that, it also induces oxytocin in your pet. So it works both ways.
Thanks. Martha, did you have something to add?
I just one quick, don't get a beagle.
Well,
I'm not going to ask why.
my true career goal is actually to be a professional dog petter and massage recipient. But there's a book that I've been reading lately called Healing is Voltage by Jerry Tennant, and in relation to my understanding of bioelectrical contributors. And Jerry Tennant says that dogs are electron donors because they roll around in the grass and they lie around, and we're not grounded. We're wearing rubber-soled shoes. We're around all this stuff. And I adopt other people's dogs because I travel too much. And I don't know what they do, but I was just the other day hugging a dog, and wow, it just totally woke me up. But I do think with regard to aggression that it may not just be one thing, it be a combination. It's a brain overload phenomenon where the brain could be having biological or psychosocial irritants, whether it's aggression or Clostridia or toxicants or food allergy combined with a social trigger. And the more stuff you pile on the mix and the less resources the person has to organize themselves, the worse it's going to be. So it's really an ecological problem. It's not just an individual problem. I haven't mentioned it, but I am starting a new clinic in the Cambridge, Massachusetts area, which most of you will not go to because you don't live there. But it's going to be an interesting east-west with June. You didn't know this. June Kong. We're going to have a very interesting east-west, including hyperbarics, including building up a not research. I have been frustrated with my brain research program because I want to measure brain change. And dynamic encephalopathy, that you said, it's not so much about the inflammation, but it's about the fact that we see kids get better. We really do see people get better. We see people overcome aggression. We see people overcome regression. The brain is not fixed when you're there. So that isn't only about aggression, but you really need to remember that this is a problem-solving situation. And the more things you do to improve, get rid of this overload, which I'm going to talk about tomorrow in my talk, the less you'll have to worry about all these complications.
Dr. Stoller, I know that everybody has said something, but this seems like a really hot topic. Do you have something to add?
Well, I'm going to quote the X-Files that the truth is out there. And I'll use a lame example. If I published a paper with the cure for ovarian cancer in it, do you know what would happen? Nothing. Okay? Because I'm not selling anything. A big pharmaceutical company isn't making $1 billion off of whatever I wrote in the paper. It will lie there. And I'm telling you, there are papers out there in the scientific literature that have the answers to a great many maladies. And because no one is making, or a corporation isn't making mega bucks off the ideas in those papers, you're not going to find out about it. And it's a lot to ask, the greater public that supposedly only has an 8th grade, education, plus or minus, to be going online and finding these answers. But the answers are out there. They don't get into the clinical practice of medicine because the physicians are basically mind controlled by the pharmaceutical companies. And that sounds very conspiratorial.
And yet it gets applause.
But it's conspiracy truth. It's not conspiracy theory. And I don't know what we can do about this other than to just, educate the man on the street about what to be doing. And we just need to be doing it ourselves and leave the old medical paradigm behind to rot. And as the CDC falls, hopefully it'll put a big kink in the current medical paradigm, and at least that's what I'm hoping. So that's what I have to say.
All right.
I just want to add that not only are the answers out there, but a lot of false that you don't hear about. The false answers are what get the press. Now, we just proved that no vitamin can ever help anybody with anything stories. The studies that are poorly designed. The studies that you're told that this number of studies prove something works and that, but they don't publish the ones that don't work. So you need, and then even away from the treatment research, there's the data that people produce and then the interpretations that they make. I've been on a tear lately that this business, that autism is prenatal, is completely not proven and not provable, because you can't, if you get tissue samples from kids that died before they got autism, you don't know what's going to happen. And if you get the tissue samples when they died with autism, you don't know how they got there. Everybody makes up these stories that it had to be in the womb. It's just not true. This thing is a progressive, ongoing process, including at the level of the cells of the brain, of the dendrites, and so forth. So you have to develop an incredible, critical, suspicious mind in order to navigate in the present situation. It's very, very important. I also want to put in a plug for my one-page 10 tips for helping autism, which is on the homepage of my book website, autismrevolution.org. It's just a nice one-page summary that you could stick on your refrigerator to remind you of the overarching picture.
Okay. I'm losing control of my panel. I'm taking it back. Stop. Stop. It's the aggression. We all need those drugs. What were they? Okay, it's hard to believe that we are almost out of time, but I have 7 panelists who I'm sure want to leave one thing very important in your mind. And so your chore in 2 minutes, because you guys have been eating it up, is each of you will get 2 minutes. If there's one thing you want this audience and everybody online to walk away with, what would it be? And Dr. Stoller, we're going to start with you.
Okay, well, okay. It's not, I'm not going to be talking about something about oxygen, believe it or not. I think, I have come across something, it's been mentioned here already, but oxytocin. Oxytocin is probably one of the most important unsung therapeutic targets for neuropsychiatric and other brain injuries that has ever come around. It's not patentable. You have to get it from a compounding pharmacy. So there's not ever going to be a big pharmaceutical company making money on oxytocin. And I have a little 99 cents. You can download it on your Kindle. Oxytocin, the hormone of hope and healing. $2.99 if you want a hard copy. It's as cheap as things can get. I made it, that's as low as it'll go on Amazon. A little booklet on oxytocin. Doesn't have everything you ever wanted to know about oxytocin, but it's an intervention that works 99.999999% of the time on 99.9999% of the problems. And you just don't find things like that in medicine. And except for you can't give it to pregnant women and narcotic and opioid addicts, it's as harmless as anything out there. And it's, if Risperdal, risperidone is something that's crossing your option pass, boy, use oxytocin way before you would consider doing something like that. It's not a cure-all, doesn't take care of all the problems, but it definitely calms down the limbic system, and it opens up, it unblocks emotional doorways that have been inappropriately closed if you use it long enough. And I can't say enough good things about it. So if you walk away from anything from me, look up oxytocin. It is an incredible, benign intervention.
And I want to remind everyone that this is just instructional, educational advice and not medical advice. Dr. Herbert, take it away.
Sure. Well, the first thing I want to say is I agree that we have to create a new system that works. And we are the future, and you are the future. And what you're doing is really important, and what we're all doing is really important. And I think we need to develop new ways to even take it upstairs and collaborate even better with each other to track what works and doesn't work. As far as things to take home that are practical, I would say 3 things. Green smoothies. Get yourself a Blendtec or a Vitamix. The brassica vegetables, the cauliflower, the kale, the broccoli, these things contain chemicals that really support your body's ability to produce glutathione. It's important, if you can, to get it organic. The second thing is fermented vegetables, because they have a very, very high dose of probiotics, 1/2 cup or so of a home fermented, something you can do at home. Vegetable can have as much as 10 trillion microorganisms. Most probiotics are billions to maybe 50 billion. 10 trillion is a lot. You have to start slow because it can provoke a reaction if your kid has a lot of gut problems. And finally, avoid sugar like the plague. Sugar feeds the bad bugs in your gut. Sugar is just really bad. It's about making money. And they strip all the supportive things that grew in the plant away from it and just give you this chemical. Just get it out of your diet.
All right. I want to sort of reiterate and echo the idea, Dr. Herbert said it well, of that this is a process. I'm just talking about autism here for a moment, but when we look at chronic fatigue, we look at fibromyalgia, these are also these types of process illnesses that were virtually non-existent 2 decades ago. I mean, really. So the chance of seeing a fibromyalgia case when I was in medical school many decades ago, 0. wasn't even recognized, was sort of dismissed for another 2 decades, and now it's a raging problem. And it's about dysfunction in the neurons by whatever means. So when you look at how to start to heal the brain, getting good nutrients in there, getting the bad GI stuff out, which contributes some possible contaminants to the brain. But also, the brain is injured. The brain cell itself is injured. Whether it's injured by a toxin, whether it's injured by a virus, the brain cell is injured. So we had to look at, okay, how do we start to heal the brain? You know, one of the fascinating things of the work, another hat I wear, is I run a depression ketamine clinic, and we're using ketamine infusion. Now, ketamine isn't happy juice like everybody thinks it is on the internet. Ketamine is a very powerful activator through a molecular mechanism, a brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a brain healing molecule. This is a growth factor that helps nerve growth factor and several other growth factors build your brain and rebuild it when it's injured. Rebuild new synapses, turn pluripotent stem cells into neurons, make new circuits, rebuild dendrites. So, and you know what helps that? Lithium. Lithium helps to activate that even better because well, it doesn't matter what the molecular biology is. And there are a number of other ways in which you can help your brain heal. And that's, I think, what the message you want to take home is, and this is one of the things that Neuroluminance really focuses on, is brain healing. And this is something I think everyone on the panel is talking to you about, is the idea that the brain is hurt, injured, under attack, and we need to heal it, not just label it.
Thanks.
Well, I'm happy to know that I've been having a green smoothie every day for at least the last 2 or 3 years. So that's, and as a take-home point is that I think one of the things you're hearing here is that we're learning how to address these disease processes based upon biological information rather than diagnostic labels. And so I just encourage you as you go through this journey is to help even the healthcare professionals with whom you are working or at least trying to work, help them to know about looking at things from the neurobiologic or from the biological level, whether it's gut issues or whether it's neurologic issues. Look at these from the functional standpoint and say, how do we look inside the body, let it help us see what works, what doesn't work? How do we make judgments, that is, therapy decisions about this based upon what we really see is working and not just upon some label that was placed upon a person at some point in time?
As a parent, I want to say that the picture of autism is much different than it was 25 years ago when my son was first diagnosed with PDD-NOS. And I think there's reason to be very much more hopeful for the outcomes of our children. So the take-home message I want you to take away from here is that in many cases, autism is treatable. But in order to best treat it, I think we really have to try to better understand the underlying biology. Everything that's been said applies. It certainly helps to start with good nutrition, et cetera. And I want to close by echoing Dr. Stoller's comment about oxytocin, and that is get a dog. It can really help. It's helped me a lot anyway.
But remember, not a beagle. They're very noisy and disruptive. And if you have squirrels in the backyard, your life will never be the same, you know? So what... Yes, it sounds just like they would be really at home in a seal colony. I think there was a mistake in evolution. They really should have gone with the seals. But the things that you should do, learn all that you can. I know that all the children who have done the best, it's mainly because most of the time their mother, occasionally their father, and in the best circumstance, both parents learned as much as they could about the causes and the treatments of autism. Number two, get comprehensive testing, because you have to know all the factors. I mean, there's a lot of common factors in autism, but there's some children who have specific abnormalities that need. So get comprehensive testing so you can address all the things that are holding your child back. And number three, don't ever give your child acetaminophen, and advise all your friends, relatives, anybody who will listen about this angle. And you can, from the website, you can get a copy of the PDF and send it to as many people as you can, warning them of the dangers of the stuff that lines the shelves of the supermarkets.
Well, everything's been said, so I just would reiterate, that's one thing. But you should write that down. That was 3 things, though. So now I'm so overwhelmed, I just want to get a beagle, a bunch of sugar, and jump off of an airplane. But, and the airline I fly will allow you to take dogs. I want you to know that. I was surrounded by dogs on either side of me in the airplane. I often, sometimes when the parents are getting overwhelmed, and if you're not overwhelmed, then that's wonderful, but you're probably in the minority in the room here, because a lot of things have been mentioned. They're all great things. And we often use these some 200 treatments on our patients, and it takes time to implement that. But whether you're a quote-unquote experienced parent, or this is all new to you, or you're just kind of rethinking things, or things are getting worse, or whatever, follow your instinct if something is not, if the people that, well-intended or not, are telling you, and I mean doctors mostly. I agree with Dr. Stoller. We're brainwashed in medical school. I don't care what anybody says, you know. We're taught that we know, and to some degree it's good that I'm not saying most practitioners are insincere, but we're the biggest marketing agents for a lot of big companies out there, and we assume that that's all correct and everything else is wrong. And if you have an instinct that something, whether it's a therapy, whether it's something like a diet, and if you want to try it but now's not the right time and you want to wait a couple months, I wouldn't wait too much longer. You kind of have to get yourself ready and be up for the game. But if a doctor is telling you things, particularly if they're negative and prejudicial and hateful, and they're trying to demean your interest in trying to help your child, in the eloquent words of my friend Mrs. Teresa Wrangham here to the right, and I'm not speaking for her, I'm just quoting her, change doctors. Get a different doctor and go on the journey that's not going to be easy, but that you really want to do. I mean, do it. And it's because you can help your child. And we see, this in patients who have cancer and people who have seizures and depression. When it's really not going right, go to somebody different. And if I'm with somebody and they're trying to come and see me, I ask them, if this doesn't work for you and you want another opinion or whatever, I'm humbled by how hard this is. But I think as you try to implement some of these things you've heard, the main action is live a clean life as much as you can. I'm not blaming people. I'm saying low toxicity foods. Man, it's hard because the kids don't want to eat the right thing. I know they don't. The adults don't want to, but it's tough. But sometimes you can sneak in some of the pea proteins and fiber and drops of lithium and things like that into the food. And oxytocin has to go in the nose or on the skin. There's no other way to do it. So these are things to do, and try, to follow your instincts and don't listen to anybody who's negative and hateful, because there are things you can do, and you can certainly make your child or yourself healthier. And then the hope is to allow their brain to heal so that it can go to a better place, so they are happy and they feel good. I mean, that's the goal, really. And hopefully there'll be some recovery with that, too.
I'm sorry.
And don't jump off an airplane.
I'm going to cut you off now. It is 5 o'clock, but I hope that we have enough time to at least thank our panel. Weren't they fabulous?